Hello and welcome to the CDO Magazine interview series. I'm Jason Masker with Stratascale, and we are partnering with CDO Magazine, MIT CDO IQ, and the International Society of Chief Data Officers in a series of interviews. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Nate Murray, Chief Data Officer at Fifth Third Bank. Nate, give us a little bit about your background. How did you get into data? How did you land at the Chief Data Officer with Fifth Third?
Okay, so I have a little bit of an atypical background. I graduated from the University of Dayton in Dayton, Ohio, and immediately landed my first startup back in the mid-90s. And I ran that startup for several years, and it grew to a point where I actually needed to create my own offshore startup corporation to support my onshore corporation. And so I ran several support outsourcing, hosting, branding type startups for several years. And then kind of into my mid-30s, after I had run my startups for a period of time, I ended up selling them, exiting the business, and getting into corporate. I did my startups early, got them out of the way, and then I landed into the corporate world at GE, kind of 10 or 15 years ago. I spent some time in GE Aviation as well as GE Digital. I did infrastructure and web development and cloud, and finally ended up in data, which is where I ended my tenure with GE. And I had a great stint there, leading the Chief Data Officer organization from a technology perspective, and then also moved into digital, kind of leading all the 10 businesses across GE as far as their data platforms were concerned. So things like going to the cloud for healthcare, going to the cloud for power and water, and others. It was a really exciting time to be there several years ago, as they had large kind of legacy footprints on Teradata and traditional enterprise data warehouses, and they were looking for more modern ways of doing big data. Obviously, Hadoop and all those types of things came. And then I ended up moving to Fifth Third about 3.5 years ago. Our CIO, Jude Schramm, was also from GE, where I had met him before. Spent some time with him, and really wanted to, start a new journey, learn a new industry. I hadn't spent much time in the finance industry, and, it being highly regulated, getting to apply some of the things that you get in industrials is a lot harder in a highly regulated industry. And so that's been a really good challenge, to now, spend the last few years of my career getting to the Chief Data Officer role and starting to apply some of those learnings from both my startups as well as my time at GE. So it's been a pretty interesting ride.
Sounds like it, yeah. So quite a path to arrive here. With the current climate as a CDO, especially at a financial institution, you just touched on regulation, but with the current climate, cybersecurity obviously high on everyone's radar and minds. How is that changing the focus and the urgency around data governance? What's the role of the data team when it comes to managing risk?
So this is a challenging one, right? A CDO in the finance industry is always going to have a healthy balance for what I'll call offensive use cases. And those are things more revenue generating or like data science and secret sauce type use cases. But then there's also defensive use cases. And that's where you're really focused on regulatory outcomes or financial reportings and things of that nature. So you have this constant push and pull. It's very healthy, where you're trying to push forward, where you have opportunity to grow revenue and do revenue generating. But then you also have this pull of, hey, needing to make sure that we stay ahead of, the kind of cyber and, other kind of environmental impact that are maybe outside the bank that may be impacting us. And those are the types of things, in addition to regulatory and financial reporting, that the defensive use cases kind of align us to. So regardless of which use cases you go after, there's sort of a three-legged stool around governance in my mind, right? The first stool is around infrastructure governance and controls, and that really comes from our CTO organization, making sure that the pathways across networking and storage and encryption and all those capabilities are built into our infrastructure. But then you have to layer on top of that the cyber team and their governance and controls that are coming out of our CISO, right? So they've got their own platforms, their own controls and governance frameworks as well. And then finally, on top of CTO and on top of CISO, then you layer on kind of the data management controls, largely coming out of my organization. And those are both at the platform level as well as in the human and automated control level. And then there's, the perpetual education of the data consumers to improve, just general overall data literacy across the company, so that, we all kind of share in the responsibility to protect our data, but it's not just my job or the CISO's job or the CTO's job. It's really everyone's job. We all play an important role in making sure that, especially in today's climate with what's going on, this stuff is paramount. There is a sense of urgency, and being highly regulated, we kind of already work with that urgency. But really that's the strategy I take. It's the three-pronged approach.
Yeah, interesting. So we might lead the efforts, but ultimately it's about elevating organizational maturity, right? And leading that.
You got it.
So you got it. It's interesting too that you mentioned CISO, you mentioned from the data office. You also mentioned infrastructure. Is that changing? How is the mission around data governance changing with an increasingly hybrid environment? There's been a big push to the cloud, multi-cloud. We still have on-prem.
Right.
How is that changing?
It's an interesting one because on one hand, I want to say it's changing really quickly, but then on the other hand, and this is really where the governance framework, and it depends on what your company or what your kind of structure is. We leverage the EDMC, which is the Enterprise Data Management Council. They have a framework called DCAM, and the DCAM framework is kind of agnostic to landing zone. Landing zone being, is it on premise? Is it in the cloud? Is it a hybrid? Is it SaaS or even a platform as a service offering? It's kind of independent, and it doesn't really matter because it gives you kind of the 8 capabilities that you want to look at, regardless of where the data is stored and where it's consumed. And those 8 capabilities span everything from like organizational design and value prop, architecture, data quality, all the types of things that you would think about for data governance. They're kind of specifically called out within that framework. And then we just apply that framework agnostic to if it's, in a mainframe on premise, if it's in AWS sitting on S3, if it's sitting in the cloud with one of our vendor partners like Workday, things of that nature. It really doesn't matter because we're applying those same principles regardless. And I think that's what gives us the ability to modernize our tech stack, but still know that we have the necessary level of controls to know that we're doing it and we're following the standards that we've set previously, and we're doing that again agnostic to where the data is stored.
Yeah, that's interesting. You bring up focusing on the capability because I talk to leaders and teams can kind of sometimes get hung up on they have their tooling, they have their what they're familiar with, but if you're focused on the capability, there's other means of delivering that capability no matter where you land, right? What about
and I think the capabilities? Yeah, let me touch on that one. So the capabilities, you're right. I think that's where if we talk about tools, you might have one tool for doing it this way, one tool for doing it that way, and I think that's where we've also tried to really simplify our tech stack. And there's not 2 tools doing the same job here. There is one tool that can span landing zones and that offers that capability, not just in a way that is done centrally, meaning through my organization. We set up the technologies and we try to build everything from a self-service perspective because ultimately we need to scale. If we're always going to be hindered with me at the bottom of the funnel having to do everything centrally for folks, take data quality, I don't know everybody's data as well as they know their own system. So why wouldn't I, if someone wants data quality, open up my data quality system so that people can self-serve and create their own rules and their own requirements, just leveraging simple self-service tool sets that we have. And that can be applied, whether it's on premise in a mainframe, whether it's in traditional Oracle, RDBMS, or if it's, somewhere else laked in the cloud somewhere, right? That's the kind of approach that we take when it comes to capabilities, and those capabilities span landing zones.
So how do you manage that? Do you kind of, do you push out a baseline? And obviously you're right. The teams are going to know more about their data. They're going to be better stewards of that data, understand, more what's going to be effective with it. But you also have compliance across the org, right? Not just in an individual team. Compliance a couple times. So
that's when you get into, again, we go back to the framework again. It's this is all defined. We've got policies and procedures, super long, very lengthy read, Word documents that kind of specify all this. And then we've got tool sets around glossary and business definitions and, data lineage and all those types of the standard things that you would see in any kind of, governance framework. But the DCAM framework, again, allows us to define all of that. And then it goes through our internal processes to make sure that everything, stays within what we require as standards before anything is published. So, we again try to operationalize our tool set, and we also lower the bar to make those tools easier to use. And then really it just becomes an organizational movement or a cultural movement to educate folks on how to do this stuff for themselves versus having a centralized function do this for them, I think, which has, been largely traditionally how things have run. Core enterprise data warehouse, big, large monoliths that somebody else has to manage and then other people just consume. It's definitely, with the advent of cloud and wanting to move faster and the speed of data, I'll call it, is ever increasing. We can't work in the traditional ways to support the needs of the business. So we've had to evolve our ways of working as well.
Well, thank you, Nate, for joining us today and for the time. Please visit cdomagazine.tech for additional interviews.